Distinguished guests and fellow colleagues, before we begin the lecture, I would invite all of you to rise. Let us observe 1 minute of silence in honor of the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. Thank you. Please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's CLC Lecture series. I'm Cherub. I'm from the Center for Liveable Cities. For those of you who are not familiar with us, the center was jointly established by the Ministry of National Development and the Ministry of the Environment and Water Resources in 2008 to distill, create, and share knowledge on livable and sustainable cities. The CLC Lecture Series is one of the platforms through which urban thought leaders and international experts share best practices and exchange ideas and experiences. In today's session, we are honored to have Mr. Tim Tompkins, President of Times Square Alliance, who will share with us his experiences in transforming Times Square from a vehicular congested crossroad to a people-oriented, lively public space. The format for today's lecture will start off with a 45 minutes presentation by Mr. Tompkins, followed by a question and answer session with the audience, which will be moderated by Mr. Michael Koh, Head of Projects and Design at SC Global. So without further ado, let's start the session by inviting Mr. Tompkins on stage. Mr. Tompkins, please.
So, thank you so much for having me here. I want to begin, of course, by just expressing my deepest condolences on the passing of Lee Kuan Yew. Of course, when a moment like this happens and we lose someone that we care about, we often have many memories, but then we also think about what has that person left behind. And I have been struck again and again and again from the time a few years ago when I first in New York met some people and then also at some conferences who were part of URA and the Singapore Tourism Board, that Singapore is really an extraordinary place in terms of what it has done and what it has accomplished and the lessons that it has to teach the rest of the world. And everything that I've heard about Lee Kuan Yew is that he was and remains, even with his passing, at the center of so many of those things, and come from a place where we have many cities that are very, very sick, and the most basic things that one calls basic but are so rarely achieved in cities, equitable housing, great transportation, a good education system, an integrated society, a civil society, safe cities, are things that we in the United States struggle terribly with. And one of the reasons why I like coming here and like talking to the extraordinary people that are part of this effort that has made Singapore such an extraordinary place is that it reminds me that it can be done. And that's why the work of the CLC is so important, I think, for the rest of the world. I may be coming here to talk about Times Square, but I'm really here to learn so many of the things that you all have done. And it was very striking for me just being reminded as I went around on yesterday and just went about the city to see the many ways in which his life and his legacy was being reflected on, and the time that people were taking in tribute to him, and the extraordinary numbers of people who wanted to participate in remembering him. And it was also a reminder for me of that central role that the public spaces in our city play. After our own moment of mourning, the September 11th attacks in New York, it was in the public spaces and in the community centers where people gathered together to express their central grief and to remember what was important in life. And of course, one may take it for granted, and we've gotten now where we take it for granted in New York, but if your public spaces aren't clean, if they're not appealing, if they're not safe, then you have no ability to come together as a community. And nothing can be more important than that. And the parks and the public realm are so important to the life of the city. And I think that you have created a real model for taking care of the basics of this that I'll talk about a little bit more. Before I talk about Times Square, I want to just say a few words about what influenced the way in which I thought about Times Square. I worked for the city's economic development agency for a while, and then I went and worked and started a project called Partnerships for Parks, which was a joint project of the City Parks Department and also an NGO that was working to try and help parks, particularly in low-income neighborhoods. And there were a number of different principles that were involved in this. And it came back, and initially, it was really just about how do we help struggling parks, and I didn't have much of a philosophy about it. And then I started learning and thinking and reading more about this. And of course, one of the people that I turned to was Jane Jacobs, who made this point, which is about parks, but it's really for any kind of open space, which is that an open space is not in itself, or a beautiful park is not in and of itself a great asset. It really is a reflection of everything that's good or bad about the society and the place that's around it. And so it can either be this tool where all of the different elements of society can come together and be that much stronger and better, or it can be a place, as it is in many cities in the US, where all the dysfunction of society is visible. And so this notion of private space being a product of what is going on around it and being a reflection of what is going on around it was a key element for me when I began to think about more deeply about the work that we were doing with parks as public spaces. The elements of parks were in some ways similar to some of the things you do here at CLC. Initially, people would come and they'd want to get involved by just doing a volunteer project. But then they'd want more resources to do more things, and so we would give them grants and resources. Then there'd be learnings about what was effective in terms of turning around a neighborhood park, and so we taught people those skills. We got them involved in the planning process for capital projects when a park was being rebuilt, and then brought them together for convocations. So again, often the starting point was someone who wanted to get involved in their public space. Maybe they were frustrated because the playground was dangerous or there was glass on the ground, or maybe they just wanted to do a civic beautification project. But then the question was, how did we take that civic energy and turn it into something different? How did we help them say, if there was a capital project to rebuild the playground, we want your opinion, not to design the park, but to shape the program of the park? How do we give them resources to bring whatever thing that they want to that public space? And this was a crucial thing because initially, and the program has changed a little bit, I think it's narrowed in some ways that aren't so good. Sometimes people will only give grants for capacity building, for making that organization stronger. But I believe that if there's a group of community people that are interested in a public space, and if they want to have a festival, they want to have a fair, maybe it's organized around health issues, whatever it is that they want to do, that a small and simple grant can do a huge amount to empower them to take responsibility for and ownership of that public space. And so very small grants lit that entrepreneurial fire, that social entrepreneurial fire for many people. And then we went more deeply into parks that were totally dysfunctional in neighborhoods like the South Bronx, and said, what if we brought all the resources of government and the private sector and all the institutions around that park together to try and turn it around in a sustained way, especially when there wasn't a lot of private wealth as there was for Central Park, which turned it around. And then we took the learnings from that and shared that with other people in terms of best practices, much as you do here with CLC. The place where it was most manifest was the Bronx River, where it was a place that literally people who lived right next to the river, and I know you're very focused on Singapore River as well, and it's been hugely restored, but there's still more work to be done. But the Bronx River was a place where there were all these industrial shops along it. It was not in good shape. You couldn't even go down it because there was so much trash and junk. This is an industrial site alongside the river that has now been completely remade into a waterfront park. The river was filled with abandoned cars, with trash. You literally could not get down it. And so a core thing that we did at the beginning was to help people imagine the river as river. So something that is true with any public space and with any city is not just to say there's something bad we want to get rid of, but what's the vision? And the vision became this project. It was actually an art project where someone had the idea of floating this golden orb down the river of the Bronx River. And so in order to do that, we had to clear away the cars. We had to get city and state agencies, all these different entities, to clear away cars and trees and junk so that you could actually have a passageway and get on a boat and go down this river that nobody had been down for a long, long time. And now there's annual canoe tours. So it was partly about saying, this is terrible, look at this junk, but it was also helping people to imagine what the vision could be. Now there's an organization called the Bronx River Alliance, and what's interesting about it is that it's not like the Central Park Conservancy that last year got a $100 million gift to take care of Central Park. They don't have that kind of money. But what they do have is this notion of social capital. Here is their board of directors, and it's organizations that have all kinds of different purposes. Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice, Columbia Center for Climate Change, Rocking the Boat, they build little boats by the river, New York Botanic Garden, Pratt Center for Community Development. So it's all of these different entities that have some kind of interest in that common asset. And you look at how complicated it is. This is a list of their partners and supporters. A long, long list, goes down to 129 organizations, and then they go into financial supporters and in-kind donors and event sponsors. It's a huge amount of work, but it's a way of gathering resources and energy and engaging people to change a place. So I left the Bronx River and these parks we were working on to come to Times Square. And I immediately looked at it as this public space that in some ways was functional and in some ways is dysfunctional. It's named after the New York Times. This was their headquarters that they built in 1904. There was another square in Manhattan that was named after the New York Herald, a newspaper. The New York Times opened its headquarters and said, we want something named after us, so they named it Times Square. Very consistent with the history of Times Square, that it's always been a commercial place. But it's always been a place also that was about media and was about entertainment. And the New York Times, of course, is the center of media. And this is the building from which the New Year's Eve ball drops. They had their first celebration in 1904 as a publicity stunt, really, for the opening of their building. A few years later, they had a ball descend down a pole, and the rest has been history, which for the US, 100 years is a long history. The Alliance came around in 1992. I'm skipping through decades here, when Times Square always had a little bit of an edge to it, but became literally the most dangerous place in America. And for decades, government had thrown every single tool at Times Square to try and change it. The irony is that Times Square represents capitalism and free markets symbolically with all of the advertising, and yet Times Square's transformation is a result of more governmental interventions than just about anything that you can ever imagine anywhere in the world. At the same time, these giant plans, which involved the use of eminent domain, the city buying up property, changing the land use and zoning laws, were not moving and were not changing. And so the property owners, led by the theaters, because we're the theater district, we have all 40 Broadway theaters, that's the boundaries of our district, and and the head of the New York Times said, we can't wait for government. We've got to step up and do some things that are going to affect things down on the ground and start addressing these issues. And so they took up this idea of a business improvement district, which was still relatively new, where private entities, the property owners and the tenants in the building said, we will charge ourselves money, the city will collect it for us, but then turn it right back over to us through a contract without any strings so that we can improve our neighborhood. And in New York City, again, it was the result of the dysfunction of government that made it happen. In 1992, it was all about the basics, the things that you guys have completely done so well in Singapore: clean and safe and friendly and fun. By the time I got in 2002, there was a need for, we were doing pretty well on clean and safe, on the basics. And so we began to think about a new set of problems that grew out of our success, which I'll talk about in a minute, and which really had to do with the congestion, had to do with a brand problem in terms of feeling like that there were some parts of the old Times Square that people were missing, that there was some authenticity that was being lost, some New Yorkness. And so we had to come up with some new ways of doing things. Again, just in terms of context, many different tools brought about some of the bigger changes in Times Square, changing the land use laws, protecting the historic theaters. They almost completely blew it. This was an approved plan for Times Square, which was called Times Square Center. And the idea was to make Times Square like Rockefeller Center. And at the same time, the theaters, the historic listed theaters, were being torn down because they had increased the zoning and the allowable building heights. And people, civic groups, rushed, and because people were so desperate to change Times Square, they said, let's just get it done. But what's missing here is that, first of all, the theaters were being destroyed, and second of all, there was none of the signs and the advertising. So the two things that were most distinctive about Times Square were under siege. And it was only because of the intervention of a whole bunch of civic groups that said, wait, there is something special about this place. You've got to pay attention to it, and you've got to make sure that you preserve those things. So they passed a law that literally required blinking advertisements on all of these buildings to preserve that part of it. And they passed a law to preserve the historic theaters with some rights going for development at adjacent sites, but the historic theaters could be approved. Over the last 20 years, since the start of the Times Square Business Improvement District, now called the Times Square Alliance, we tried to, at our 20-year point, we tried to think about what are the core principles that have led to some of the successes in Times Square. Let me just get a drink. Excuse me. The first are some core public space principles, and ones that I think Singapore has mastered in many ways. It's got to be well designed. The important thing, though, is that design isn't enough. We all know some beautiful parks, some beautiful public spaces that are lifeless and soulless. It also, or dangerous. It has to be managed well, it has to be safe, someone has to be maintaining it, someone has to be patrolling it. But then the other thing that brings life to a public space is how it's programmed. In the broadest sense, what happens there? How are you drawing on those assets that Jane Jacobs talks about from around the community? How has that space become a manifestation of what is great about a place or a city? We also felt that we learned a lot from just saying, in some sense, there are no clear rules. You have to expect the unexpected. In 1992, it was all about clean and safe. By the time I came into this job in 2002, it was all about the problems of our success. The sidewalks were so crowded, it took you 20 minutes to walk 3 blocks. Things change. We all, especially when we work in institutions, can get stuck in the notion of the problems of yesterday are what we're paying attention to, and we're not noticing the new set of problems. We realized that there was a tremendous value in taking a chance and to try different things. And you'll hear about that with respect to a few of our different programs. And the other great risk for all of us as urban planners, even as we note, and it's very important to note successes and learn from other places that tell us this can be done or something can be different, that there's no single answer. We've all seen the phenomenon of something like the Bilbao effect, where someone builds a great building because that's the centerpiece of their tourism strategy, but they haven't figured out what to put in the building or to do in the building. And oftentimes very good ideas can't only be replicated without understanding the context. We found that a key part of our success that has been a series of partnerships, and I'll talk a little bit more about those. And a key part of that is recognizing what are the strengths and weaknesses of the private sector, the NGO sector, and the government sector. Obviously, they all bring different things, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A or in other ways. But most importantly is this notion, and this is how you also avoid the error of just mindlessly replicating something. Know thyself and love thyself. So think deeply about what is distinctive, what are the authentic assets that you have, not just not just with respect to a public space, but as a society, as a city, as a place. Know what's distinctive, because we all know, just like you snap into a new perspective when a major event happens, like the death of Lee Kuan Yew, and you sort of shift back and you see a different picture, you're reminded of some things that you've taken for granted or you've forgotten, that's an important part of what must be done, especially with an asset that may be struggling or not fully performing. And then once you know what's distinctive, you've got to love it and celebrate it and nurture it. You'll see in a bit that it's also important to have the facts. Yes, have that gut sense about what's distinctive about your brand, but also be able to back it up, because you're going to want to make the case about what is distinctive. And sometimes, in our case, you have to define what a new set of problems is, because part of the problem with Times Square right now is that we're doing well economically, but we've got a whole bunch of problems that if we don't solve, we're going to be in trouble in 5 years. And so sometimes you have to use the facts to reframe what the new problem is, which is what we did in Times Square. And then the idea of partnerships, not just for the sake of getting things done, but also for having allies as you move forward with your new plan. Running through all of these things are a few other core principles, many of which are drawn on my experience with parks, but I found interestingly to be true in this place, which is the least natural place on the planet, which is the importance of bottom-up or community-based, that there's a real recognition that the people down on the ground in a neighborhood or in a place often know more about it than anything else. Doesn't mean that they're the final authority, but basing something on the community so there's a sense of ownership. Any form of intervention, when one is thinking about programming, if it's not consistent and it's not coherent and it's not concentrated, in other words, if it's spread all over the place, if there's not an underlying logic behind it, then you're not going to move the needle. You're not going to shift things. One of the ways in which you help people see something new is tapping into the power of the creative community, which exists in every city and in every place, and I'll talk a lot more about that. And then critical mass. This notion of a tipping point, that only when you have all of these things together, you may try something again and again and again, and it doesn't shift, and then someday it shifts. So when we started off, it was all about taking on crime. 42nd Street was the most dangerous block in America. And we started with partnerships. We did partnerships so that the people who, we have about 140 full-time employees. About 100 of them are either sanitation or security. The sanitation folks were people, there was a huge homeless problem in Times Square. The sanitation folks are people who have been in drug and alcohol rehab programs, coming back into the workforce, and then they work on a trial basis with us, and then they're eligible to become full-time employees. Our security guys often are delivering just information to members of the public. But once we had Safe and Clean down, then we had to focus on the issues that were coming at us, which was the intensity of the congestion and that it was so busy in Times Square and there was not enough public space. So we had to reframe the problem. I would go to talk even to my own board members and say, we're doing pretty well, because they were comparing it to the 1980s and the 1990s. And so we went and we did surveys. We started getting publicity about negative things, where you've heard about gridlock when cars are stuck. We started talking about pedlock, and we put out studies that show how our sidewalks were more crowded than anyone others. And then we had to go to the transportation ministry, which at that point was very dominated by the traffic engineers, who didn't even have anything in their formula that took into account the people who were walking on the streets because there wasn't enough room on the sidewalks. So we had to do literally $70,000 worth of different studies to convince them what was going on. And then for my own constituents, I had to sort of say, things may be all right, but people are starting to say that the congestion in Times Square is almost as much of a threat, or feels like as much of a threat as crime was 20 years ago, because it's keeping people from going to the theater, from coming to the neighborhood. So we got out the facts about how much pedestrian growth was coming on. We talked about how ugly our public realm was as a way of saying we've got to do better. And then we began to experiment. And first, it was just an intellectual experiment. We wanted to simply help people, again, as I say, imagine a different possibilities. So on the one hand, we went to some people, an advertising agency, and we said, what are the core characteristics of this brand? Because a lot of people would sometimes say, I miss the old Times Square. And they weren't missing the fact that they would get stabbed if they walked through Times Square, but they felt that there was something about it that was a real New York edge. There was something, and some of my property owners were just completely dismissive. They said, come on, get over it. Times Square and, crime isn't, who wants to go back to crime? But I felt that there was something there that we needed to look into. And so this is why we started saying, what are our authentic characteristics? And this branding agency helped us look at some of those things. We went to a bunch of historians that written books about Times Square and said, what are some of the core characteristics of this place? It's about news and media. It's about crowds of people coming together. It's always been about sex and desire and about pushing the envelope. It's always been about entertainment, whether it was movies or Broadway. And it's always been about this visual spectacle of the signs. Part of what grew out of that was a focus on, let's celebrate the distinctive design in our neighborhood and give some awards for both new design but also the historic design. Let's take our visitor center and make it a place where we're telling the history of Times Square. And then we brought together a bunch of planners and architects and thinkers and said, as we begin to think about remaking Times Square, what do we need to pay attention to? And again, they talked about the distinctive characteristics, that it can't just be made like any other place, that it has to be a little bit chaotic, because that's what Times Square and urban life is about. Think not just about the big signs, but what's happening down on the ground in this giant square. Notice that there's people who are just walking through Times Square, and there's people who are there to watch what's going on, but there's no place to stop and watch. So we pulled that together with this design trust group, and then we started talking about streets and walking. And this was back in 2003 when we didn't really have a receptive audience. The transportation minister called me up and screamed at me because she felt that I was being critical by talking about these pedestrian problems. But we relied on a core set of principles, which was to balance the old and the new, recognize the diversity of what was here, to make Times Square a place that New Yorkers want to come to. And if you do that, then it feels authentic, and then the tourists will want to come. And you have to do that by recognizing what's authentic and historic. Celebrate creativity through distinctive design and art and performances. Think about the relationship between pedestrian and vehicular spaces and change that. Think about Times Square, and this was a great metaphor, as an ever-changing theater set, where it's this simple place that is constantly changing. And most importantly, keep it simple and don't over-design, which can also be a great risk in urban planning. So how did we help then we had to help people imagine what was going to be different about this place. So we had a whole series of workshops. I saw that you all worked with Jan Gell. We had him come in and talk to us about a different way of imagining how streets could be used. We had some people that had done public realm improvements in London come and talk. We had a series of workshops where people came in with crazy ideas, like painting the entire base of Times Square blue, or putting these giant planters that couldn't be moved. And what was important was that this was part of the exercise of helping people imagine something different from what was. And that's why it was valuable. So meanwhile, the amount of space that was the pedestrian space in Times Square relative to, if you include the space for cars, was 37%. We started off by just wanting to get a little bit more space on the sidewalks, maybe increase sort of the center island. We talk about connecting, we had this vision, this didn't happen, but taking up a lane of traffic on both Broadway and 7th Avenue and having a central promenade for the tourists so they could actually take a picture. It took us all those years and all those studies to get DOT to give us a pilot experiment to change the traffic patterns in preparation for that. And then we got permission to take up a lane of Broadway and a lane of 7th Avenue and expand this one piece of public space that we had, which I'll show a picture of. And that was dramatic, and the world didn't end. It was the result of our studies. And then the transportation minister changed. Bloomberg got more green than he had been before. And we had a meeting, and we came in prepared to say, hey, look, we want to get 50% more space. And they said, we've got an idea. Let's close down Broadway. And I took a deep breath, and I thought, let's try this. And it would have been impossible if we hadn't spent, this was in 2008, we spent 5 years establishing the fact that there was a new problem that needed to be solved. And when I went to the press conference with Mayor Bloomberg, I said, they say if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But there's no question that when it comes to pedestrian and vehicular traffic and congestion in Times Square, it's broke. We've got to try something. And the other thing that the mayor did, which was brilliant, which was he said, we're going to try this on a temporary basis, and if it doesn't work, we'll go back. And all along the way, we did surveys and studies, and again, we had established that there was a problem that needed to be solved. It ended up passing muster. I'll take you through that, and now has become permanent. But the first thing that was important was just before that, we had completed rebuilding Duffy Square, that little sliver of park in Times Square. This is what it used to look like. This tiny space, the only real gathering space was around that statue, and it was fenced in. So no one ever stayed there, and then this is where people would get their discount tickets, and as you can see, they would spill over into the street. So this is where we got an extra lane on either side taken up from the street. And then we went back to a design and built something that was very distinctive. And this is where it gets back to the authenticity and the assets. We went and we said the reason this design was so good was because, first of all, it reflected a kind of Greek amphitheater, so it referenced the theater, a core characteristic of Times Square. Second of all, the steps were lit with a gentle glowing LED light, reflecting the energy of the signs in Times Square. Well, instantly, we put down these tables and chairs, and for the first time, people were able to watch what we called the second best show on Broadway, which was the life of the city itself. Now, mind you, one of the most important people in the theater community, when I would show him the designs for these steps, he was stuck in this mode of what was bad, and he said, what are you going to do to keep the bums and the prostitutes off those steps? Because he was so obsessed with the idea that any public space would only be dysfunctional if it happened in Times Square. And in fact, in 1977, there had been a proposal to close part of Times Square, the streets in Times Square. And the New York Times, our other patron founder, at that point said it shouldn't be done because it would become a pimp and prostitute promenade. That's how low people's confidence was in the public spaces. Well, this proved not to just be something that helped people imagine that Times Square could be a place where people could observe what's going on, but it also began to shift our brand because it was an investment in distinctive architecture, much like you have done with some of the big signature projects here like Marina Bay, and I'll talk about that. But then the time came to close the street, and this is literally what it looked like, not pretty. And it was fascinating because we put these chairs down, and suddenly people were sitting in them like they had been hanging out in Times Square their entire life. It was astonishing. Some people hated it. The New York Post, the more conservative newspaper, the New York Times loved it. We had a lot of maintenance problems because people started hanging out there, and we didn't have our security people. This is not one of my better quotes. It looked like a bomb hit, so I've learned how to deal with the press a little bit better. But the fact is we weren't prepared for how much they were being used. People loved these lounge chairs that we put out so much that they made T-shirts about them. They did surveys, and people really liked them. Here's a little bit of background on it.
A surprise summertime hit has mesmerized people up and down Broadway.
It's inspiring.
Causing some to search in vain for words to describe why this summertime sensation, the act of sitting in a chintzy lawn chair on a blocked-off city street, is so...
I'm trying to come up with something really wise to say, and I can't.
Nor can I. other than to say that this pilot project of diverting automobile traffic to create pedestrian plazas in certain sections of Times Square was a bold move. Stronger, more durable furniture was ordered, but couldn't be delivered until August. So just 6 days before the Memorial Day opening of the plazas, Tim Tompkins, president of the Times Square Alliance, went into Code 1 scramble mode, rummaging through a couple of local hardware stores for a quick fix order of cheapo lawn chairs. Nearly 400 of them.
They're all raggedy. I mean, they're raggedy as hell.
But at the same time, oddly cool, in a strange, kitschy kind of way.
Who would have thought?
That so many people could sit so deep in thought on a cacophonous urban canyon floor, surrounded high and low by every kind of distraction under the sun.
Just taking it all in.
It's funny how the mind blocks out extraneous thoughts when focused on things of great significance, like the phenomenon of blending contrasting ingredients to come up with something incredibly tasteful, often by accident. As for this strange concoction, well, on paper this seems like a pretty stupid idea, but it works because it taps into a powerful human need.
People watching, yeah.
It's like, oh my God, it's just sitting here, people watching, and you got Times Square like right in front of you. It's like, you know, surreal.
Grab a chair and see for yourself.
It's a beautiful lifetime.
New York City and any big city is about rushing. You know, it's about looking at your BlackBerry. It's about doing 10 things at once. And so it is radical to simply sit still and look.
And when he says still, he means still. Statue-like still.
And it's very peaceful amongst all the chaos.
A welcome bit of calm for the city that never sleeps.
I just think this is the best idea ever.
This theater of the absurd, where looking at people, is a show in itself.
Jeez.
For today, Mike Leonard, NBC News, New York City.
So when we were done with those chairs, we made them into a sculpture. The New York Post hated the sculpture, but people started taking pictures with it, and then we took it away. But then the dialogue began to shift. New York Magazine, which was very cynical about Times Square, started to use positive words. And here, delirious is a positive word with respect to Times Square. So the people's perceptions started to shift. Now, this is one of the plazas. It's being converted into something much nicer looking. It's being built out. And you see that we have some commercial activities there. Starts off looking very good. Well, we've got a new set of problems now, which is we have, now that a public space has been created, all these hustlers and hawkers are out there. And so we have these folks that are out there, and not hawkers in the sense of the nice vendors that you have here with food, but people who are trying to rip people off. And so literally it's gotten out of control where you have, and part of the issue here is that people make jokes about it, but it's actually, people are being taken advantage of. We have all these different activities, I won't take you through them, but all these different unregulated commercial activities are pouring into this space, and there aren't the adequate management and legal tools to deal with them. This is just from one Saturday night where we counted all these different variations of these people that are coming out at you, and we have a new public relations nightmare where Times Square is a town square. It should be a place where there's a lot of lively and unexpected things and surprises, but this is out of control. You walk through there and you just get besieged by these people. So we're back in the data collecting mode. We're showing that we have very distinctive set of issues. Setting a new set of regulations for managing commercial activities in public space is potentially very controversial if you're talking about it for the entire city. So we're saying, look, we have a unique set of circumstances, and we are now proposing a unique set of solutions. We're in the early stages of this. We tried to get a bill passed to regulate these costume characters like Mickey, and it became an issue where the story got cast that this was just about a small entrepreneur trying to make a living rather than a consumer protection issue. So I talked about design it well, manage it well, and program it creatively. So while we have this disaster on our hands of people not feeling great about Times Square, how do we shift perceptions, and how do we shift also the nature of the experience themselves? So one of the early things, New Year's Eve has been around a long time, but the Alliance got involved in the 1990s to really shift that event to make it more of a public relations opportunity. I could talk a lot more about that, but the core has been allowing broadcast networks, really hosting them and making it very easy for them to broadcast entertainment from every different network around the world. But then we keep adding things because we want to have fun and we want it to be distinctive. So we test the confetti a few days before midnight. Does the confetti need testing? Not necessarily, but it gets us attention and makes people laugh. Then but we also said, what's the essence of this event? Why do almost 1 million people gather in Times Square? And we said it's because it's about celebration and reflection and renewal. Celebrating the good things in life, reflecting on where we've been during the last year, and looking forward with a sense of hope. So we created this idea of people writing their wishes for the new year on a piece of confetti, and that confetti gets dropped at midnight in Times Square, going deeper into a theme. I'll skip a video about it. Then we said it's also about letting go. It's about looking forward, but it's about letting go of bad things. So we created this Good Riddance Day where people write things that they hate, like my marriage and my cheating husband, and then put it into an industrial strength shredder, as well as serious things like low-paying jobs or war. So we get personal messages on these wishes and ones for the world, but it's a way of going deeper into the theme, keeping it fresh. Some people destroy their old cell phones that didn't work, all that kind of stuff. And then this year we added a new element, which is a charity. So we celebrated the International Rescue Committee because we wanted to get deeper into that sense of hope that's so affiliated with New Year's Eve, because you've got to keep it fresh. You have to go to the core of what it's about. For now a couple decades, we've had an outdoor restaurant festival. We did an outdoor Broadway concert, which we stopped doing. And this is another thing. Sometimes you got to stop doing stuff. Initially, the real point of this was to prove that you could have a family event in Times Square back in 1992. By the time we got a few years ago, it wasn't really promoting the shows, and we didn't need to establish that anymore. So we stopped that. But we started coming up with new things like this notion of yoga in Times Square. And we were trying to reach a different demographic. We said anybody can find peace of mind on the top of a mountain. Try finding it in the middle of Times Square. And the first year there were 3 of us in 2003, me, a yoga friend, and one of his students. And the New York Times wrote an article saying, if you're lying on the ground in Times Square at 5 in the morning, which is when we had this first class, chances are you are homeless, drunk, or dead. Well, 10 years later, we have literally 13,000 people. It's always on the summer solstice. And the images get sent around the world, and it's one of these perception changers. We get the cost covered by sponsorships. Then we wanted to tap into the creative community. February is a slow, cold month, so every year we've done a competition with emerging architects to design some facsimile of a heart. And every year it's a different thing, and it brings attention to this part of Times Square and taps into the fact that Times Square is a great place to go for romantic activities. We celebrate a big wedding and a renewal of vows ceremony to tap into the idea of it's a romantic destination. So tapping into creativity. We also wanted to remind people of our history. Some of you may have seen the famous picture of the sailor kissing the nurse at the end of World War II. So we did a kiss-in where we encourage people to kiss each other and recreate that event. Again, we don't do that every year. We're going to do it. So if you're August 14th, if you're in Times Square, we'll give you a flower and a cap. And kiss a stranger or kiss someone that you brought along. As I said, we have a perception issue with Times Square not being considered authentic. And so with the plazas, we're starting to do some different kinds of programming. Movie nights where we did movies that were based on Broadway musicals, having a lunch series. We brought this farmers market out into the plaza because the idea, again, kind of like the yoga of having farmers in the middle of Times Square seemed crazy, fitness classes. Now, some of these worked, some of these didn't. So we're not going to do the movie night or the fitness classes again, but we'll probably do the green market. So that's the idea of try it out, experiment. One of the most central things we've done has been tapping into the creative community and establishing a public arts program. I created a director of public art, and I've actually just last week promoted her to a broader position, which is creative director, where the essence of her job, it used to be just about doing public art, and we did it on the big screens. We did different art projects and installations. We did performances in unknown and out-of-the-way venues around the district. But the idea was to tap into all the creativity that exists in New York City and to have it be on display in this Times Square, which is kind of a town square for New York. And we also, the best things were ones that tapped into the identity of Times Square. This was an interactive thing where you'd go and vote on capitalism. And it's obviously like an old-fashioned advertising sign. And there's also a piece of it where people would get interviewed afterwards. And part of this is, you have to operate from a position of strength. No, Times Square is the most capitalistic place in the world. So we can afford to joke about it. Just like with our Valentine's event, we can get a little bit saucy with that now because some of the things in terms of crime and sex and some of the things that were so threatening to Times Square before aren't there anymore. Other aspects of our public art program, this is the opening night of the Metropolitan Opera. And then what you see on the screens here is our Midnight Moment program, where we have extraordinary videos shown on 44 of the big digital screens. I want to get them all, but it's again tapping into this unique asset that we have. I won't show this whole video, but I'll just show you a couple pieces of what it looks like.
Animal. It was a natural extension to make a project where I took the sort of nature around New York and brought it back into the center. I like the idea of bringing the cliffs of the river sort of into the center of the city and having those cliffs be part of the project. And so
this happens every night from 11:57 p.m. Until midnight. And every month we change the offering. Sorry. Just want to show one other. This is one where there's a mapping the brain.
To have one piece that is a midnight moment, another piece that's going to be explored through the construction fencing on the mesh for the next few months.
And the idea of the Times Square being kind of like the neocortex of the city.
Everybody was smiling.
When the sound came to it, it just changed my whole perspective.
So then we experimented with having people have earphones.
Amazing night, because not only did we have Ryoji Ikeda with phenomenal visual work, the first time sound combined with the Midnight Moment.
Complete synchrony between two senses, just like a synthesis of concept, video, audio.
The music took you, but everyone having the headphones on, right? So it gave us like a little intimate moment to oneself as well, right in Times Square.
Well, what's the history behind the music, though, and all the images and everything, looking at data and what you can do with it?
It's like not like a musical composition. There's like randomness involved, and it's coming from a data stream.
Took it from binary, and he synced all the music, and he kind of made a science out of it.
Right in the heart of Times Square, so we were jamming in here, you know what I mean?
So a key part of what we do is the events themselves, but we also repackage them digitally and spread them out through our social media channels because we realize that part of the importance is the branding and getting the ideas out there. So the final piece of what we're doing now is this notion, just like the canoes going down the river, of helping people imagine what this public space can be. Because right now, people can only see the negative things that are happening. We've been doing the programming, but we're asking people to help us craft a vision. This is a staff vision that we have, that it's thriving, it's innovative, it's designed in a distinctive way, it's beautiful, it celebrates the elements of what New York City are about, commerce and culture, and it celebrates our past and our future and reflects the best of the city and the world as its kind of town square. And the way we did get people thinking about this is for my board members, for community members, we asked them these questions. What's your nightmare of what Times Square will be? And most of them will say these costume characters and these hustlers and hawkers. But what's also your fantasy? And what do you want to see that will still be there? And what specific things do you want to see happen there? This is the act of helping people imagine. So constantly throughout this process, at different points, we're trying either through questions or through artists to get people to imagine something differently. And then we start to distill what their answers are, that it has to be changing, but remember our past. That it's okay to be commercial, but not if the civic is overwhelmed. Let it be a place where you can relax, but not ordinary and boring. Curate something original, but let there also be things which are not curated and are spontaneous. Let it be transparent, but not out of control. And welcome visitors, but make sure that New Yorkers want to be there. So again, these principles: design it, manage it, program it, know things change, take a chance, try things out. Don't suffer from the illusion that there's a single answer that applies everywhere. And as you're moving forward, have the partnerships, public and private sector. Know thyself, know your distinctive characteristics, really think about it, celebrate it, and nurture it, and use facts to reframe the problem, and then always have these core community principles where these things cumulatively make a difference. And then you can have the most crazy things in the world happen. What's this mean for Singapore? Or what things have I observed looking at Singapore? You guys are doing very well. I think that you've done an extraordinary job of repositioning yourself as a tourism destination. Just looking at this book that I saw in the airport, both sending a message about being the new and celebrating the new, distinctive architecture that really shifts the brand, but also in the same book, pictures of your authentic and original assets. Paying attention not just to the new buildings, but to the distinctive things you have that are old, that are authentic, that are distinctive about this place. But letting them coexist, because that is what Singapore is about from what I see, and that's what you've done so well. You've got great philosophies about how to maintain and take care of public spaces. You have a challenge in a sense because you have a lot of indoor spaces that are extremely well curated and comfortable and nice. So you've got to make your public realm even more effective to be a draw. And I'll say that all the details, as someone just coming from my New York experience, even the insides of your buses are pretty. And you know, these are things that may seem crazy, but that I noticed someone coming here, this obsession with how can we do better. What I saw, I teach a NYU grad school course, and I have people read chapter 4 of Hard Truths from Lee Kuan Yew, because I feel that Singapore has been intensely rigorous about assessing what its strengths and weaknesses are in the global economy. And what I see with the work that you're doing with city planning is that same kind of rigor of like, how can we do better? Where are we weak? Rate our website, tell us what we can do better. And I see all of these signs that things are going well in terms of the public realm on places like Orchard Road, paying attention to the details, whether it's like a perfectly painted fire hydrant or the beauty, and I don't know whether this is public or privately funded, but these details that make a difference that you may take for granted that other cities would die for. And other things that just other cities can't get right. I mean, bicycle racks next to a transport station, duh. Public toilets that are open all the time, duh. We can't do it in New York. You have this amazing asset of the city, which has been brought back to life in terms of environmentally, and which has a lot of potential. And they too are focusing on this is where it all began. What are the core characteristics of this place? You've got this icon for tourism that I think sends a very valuable message, where also the public space has been well designed, well built, well maintained. I went and looked at this park that was listed on one of your sites as a place that's really been transformed, and also saw how that has been environmentally transformed, but is also being made into a community center. I walked around some of the smaller parks, beautifully maintained, and just amazing assets in the midst of the busy, bustling city. Yes, there's high rises, but and I understand you have a heritage tree program as well. I see you doing the things that we've talked about, experimenting, the 6-month experimenting on Orchard Road, the concert series to bring life to a park and have the best of the city's cultural assets be on display in the parks, and the constant programming of Marina Bay. Some of it, I'm sure, just like for us, some of it may work, some of it doesn't, so you learn, you try, you grow. Now you're at a point where there's a path ahead, but things have shifted with Lee Kuan Yew's death, and it's an opportunity to think about what are we holding on to, what are the things that what are the ways in which we're going to evolve? How do we have sort of the space for the small and the organic next to the inorganic, and the built? How do we allow for individuality and differences and color amidst sort of the private sector buildings, the public sector buildings? How do we balance these different things? How do we take advantage of the fact that you are a very successful multicultural society and you have the elements that make a great city and a great society, which is a mix of people and energy that is the essence of what urban life is about, that friction and that alchemy where something new is created from all these different things coming together. As a final reflection, I went to the exhibition about Singapore artists at Marina Bay in the museum, the Art and Design Museum, Art and Science Museum. And I think there were a few things that were really interesting to think about. This is just made me think about how will things unfold. And this is fascinating. This is a Oriental rug made out of dust, Hannah Bertram. And these are all Singaporean artists. This is an ongoing series of installations where dust is transformed into ornamental carpets. The dust for this site-specific work was collected from artist studios in Melbourne and MRT stations, the Botanic Gardens and construction sites in Singapore. No adhesive is used, so accidental footsteps, curious fingers, and insects can affect the work. The objective is to explore the fragile and contemporary existence of the work, focusing on the preciousness inherent in the everyday. This is this notion of what are the hidden assets that we take for granted and how can they be recast and reformed that are in our midst. This is another artist. The wires makes visible one of the key infrastructures of our urban environment, power lines. They're often seen to be despoiling the cityscape, but in Chia's work, their aesthetic qualities are revealed, causing us to ponder the poetry of our architectural environment. How do we see the ordinary in a new way? That's how we've tapped into the creative power of creative people in Times Square to help them see it differently. This is another one where Bottles and Fans is a sound installation consisting of glass bottles and traveling fans. The fans are placed on top of the bottles, which create a rich sound experience. The water evaporation resulting from the fan's cooling force orchestrates a melody which changes over time. These ordinary objects creating music in a new way, and music which changes as the circumstances change. And then the final piece is one that inspired me in a whole bunch of ways. So this is the way, in New York City, with respect to public realm, this is the way the government used to interact with people. It would be talking to itself and playing with itself. The government in the 70s and 80s went flat on its back. It was broke. People rose up to change Central Park. People rose up to form bids. And so then there were two players. And so then there was a relationship set up. There was a two-way relationship. But this is the way the government sort of responded for a while, which was not thoughtfully, not really responding in a thoughtful way. And these partnerships, these organic civic partnerships that grew out of, frankly, in New York, a kind of failure of government, started to evolve. And so it became, over time, an understanding that this was a two-way street, a way of engaging people. Then the different silos of government started talking to each other and coordinating with each other and coordinating with multiple players out in the world. And then this was the final piece. So Lee Wen, his work is motivated by a desire to use art to interrogate stereotypical perceptions. Ping Pong Go Round reinvents the structure and rules of ping pong to show alternative models of interaction between the players. Unlike the traditional table, his table has no borders, allowing multiple possibilities for a broader dialogue between players involved. So you look at this and you think, oh my God, what a nightmare, right? You think about there's no rules, it's all over the place. But think about that list of organizations with the Bronx River. 120 different organizations. It is so much more difficult and so much more intense to have these multi-party relationships. And again, in the US, they've grown out of the failure initially of city government to solve problems. And then the civic spirit and a cynicism in our political system about government. And the civic spirit and the entrepreneurial spirit created a lot of these NGOs to try and improve cities, improve parks, improve the public realm. And the city has learned how to work with us and how to tap into the energies, not just the financial energy, but the creative and entrepreneurial energy. So this is a model that involves a lot more work. it can drive you crazy, and it doesn't always produce the best result, and so it's not the solution for every situation. But I saw this and I thought, this is an interesting metaphor for the ways in which our relationships in a civic society can evolve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Tompkins, for your very interesting and insightful presentation. Let us now invite Mr. Tompkins and Mr. Koh up on the stage for the question and answer session. Ladies and gentlemen, during the Q&A session, please state your name and organization before asking questions or making comments. You might like to raise your hands, and the roving microphone will come to you. I will now hand over the time to Mr. Koh. Mr. Koh, please.
Hello everyone. First, big thank you to Tim. I think he really gave a fantastic speech and really showed us pictures that showed the change of Times Square over a period of time. I've experienced Times Square in the 90s up to the most recent visit 2 years ago, and I can act as testimony for the change that has happened, literally. From being frightened in the 90s, early 90s actually, to being totally comfortable in a place that has become a city room for a whole urban society. So congratulations, Tim. You've endured, I think, 13 to 14 years?
13 years.
13 years as head of this very challenging organization. Congratulations. I'm going to ask Tim a few questions, and please join in as well. But I think we have some key members in the audience who are also very active in business associations. I think we have Stephen Goh, maybe that's Stephen. He is ED of the Orchard Road Business Association. I think we have other representatives from various organizations who also are involved in activating public spaces. First and foremost, I'd like to start it off, if you don't mind. It's all about money, I think. At the beginning, I think you said private sector stepped in and the failure of government, and they contributed the funds. I think at Orbra, there are always situations of, where's the money coming from? Is the government giving the money, or are all the shopping centers giving us the money? And the shopping centers are not giving the money. So then, does the STB give the money? That's the tourism board. So how do you actually work around this funding model? I think this is a first question I'd like to start off the dialogue with. And Stephen, do join in, and anyone else do join in about this big question of how do you get the money and how do you spend it?
Well, I think there has to be a sense that I think there's two ways in which the private sector steps up and says we're going to do something. One is for a negative reason, and this could be the mothers in the playground or the, frankly, billionaire property owners who say, I've got an asset that is threatened because issues are not being solved. And so the first is that people are upset or unsatisfied with something that's happening, or they may feel that things are good, but they recognize that there's a competitive threat on the horizon. They may say, we're doing all right, but the first business improvement associations in Toronto were smaller commercial strips, not central business districts, that were responding to the creation of malls in downtown Toronto. And they were afraid of what was going to happen, and so they said, we're going to bring together money to improve our streetscapes and to market ourselves collectively. The other alternative is that people get excited about a vision, and they say, we want to do something bigger and better. In part, though, it always has to come back with the private sector to enlighten self-interest. Like, this is good for my long-term economic interest, and either somebody else is not doing it right, or I can do it better because I know my neighborhood. I know what is unique and distinctive, or this certainly in the U.S. relative to government, I as the private sector can be more nimble and can act more quickly and in a more nuanced way than a government agency that A, has to take care of all of the city, not just my neighborhood, but also has to follow a more complex set of rules.
So how does the private sector then contribute funds towards
So the way it gets set up, sorry, I didn't answer that core question. So the way it gets set up is it's set out by state law But what happens is the majority of the property owners, in two senses, have to approve. So if you have 100 properties, 51 of them have to say, we are agreeing to tax ourselves. They agree on what the boundaries of their district is. And then it also is a weighted vote so that the bigger properties who are going to pay more of the money also, so you have to have 51% of the total value of the properties. So if the properties amount to 50% of the total value of all the properties in the district, those 10 have to be on board, or you have to reach 50% somehow. And then once it's set up, there is the same bill that a property owner gets collecting their real estate tax, has a line on it that says you have to pay a little bit more for the bid services. And then the city collects it and turns it over to us through a contract.
Well, here's a question for Stephen then. Would this be a useful formula for you?
Actually, money is still a issue for us, but I think we have moved on. Actually, being a member of the Orchard Business Association has a lot of privileges because 16 years ago, when we set up to the membership fee, which is a non-compulsory, 16 years later, our fee is still the same. So we have not increased our membership fee. However, our revenue has increased as a result of us having to partner Singapore Tourism Board take over some of the project, and we're able to raise some sponsorship. But that is not definite. So on the sustainable basis is that it's still a struggle for us year on year. So we are not into a formal bid yet, while we are still having a lot of discussion with URA and STB on that. But someday, sometime, I believe a hybrid model could take place for a place like Orchard Road, where the building owner could contribute part of it and the government contribute the other part of it, become a PPP model. Our constant struggle is that as an association, right now we focus almost like 70% of our time in organizing events because we need to make it work in order to have a revenue to continue to support. But the burden for us is that we continue to upkeep Orchard Road on the public space. That's where we close the Orchard Road every first Saturday of the month, and the 6th-time trial just been over, and then we are reviewing the public response. From the initial public response, I think everybody loved it, just like we are not very sure, we just try. And of course, we get negative feedback, we get positive feedback. And not everything that we do are for a commercial reason. But we believe that this kind of activation is good for the public space, but at the same time, it involves a lot of investment. So we can't continue to sustain this kind of activity on a longer term basis. So I think for Orchard Business Association to continue to move on, I think we need to come to terms with sustainable revenue in order to continue. As a matter of fact, our membership fee as a percentage of our operating cost is only 3%. So imagine, the other 97% we had to come from other revenue just to sustain the operations. Our struggle is also the congestion. Of course, we want to thank our founder, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, that had the vision for Orchard is a 3-line boulevard. I think there's a very distinct difference between us and other shopping street. Our struggle is that the city planner also trying to create underground connections and less attention on the streetscapes. And even to a certain extent, the transport department also closed certain pedestrian crossing. So we are still have that kind of struggle on an ongoing basis, and should pedestrian take precedence or should the motorists? So these are all our constant battle every day. Thank you.
Great. Stephen, thank you for sharing this. Is there anyone else in the audience who'd like to add on? There's a little lady down there. Could you please introduce yourself?
My name is Jayashree Kurup. I come from India, and I'm a journalist with the Times of India. I have been specializing in urban affairs. And in India, Tim, a lot of the problems are what you're talking about. A lot of the movements come because of dissatisfaction with the quality of service delivered by the government. But and we have been participating in many of these movements. One of the biggest problems that we encounter is there may be a group of, you're dissatisfied with a service and therefore you form a core body and try to effect change. But then the situation is that the government is talking to itself. You're hitting a wall every time. How do you get over that so that you can get on to something more creative and long-lasting?
Sorry, what the core question is, how do you get over which?
Dealing with governments, because the whole issue started because you are dissatisfied with the government service, and when you propose something, there will be many challenges in dealing with those same government officials where the service was, there was deficiency of service.
Well, it's in some ways it's not. It's similar to the answer to the question about why would the businesses get involved is ultimately over time the resistance may be at the beginning, but ultimately over time I think what we've seen is that the collective actions produced better results. We do a lot of things that actually make the city's life easier. Day in and day out we may have tensions with a lower level minister about something, or a lower level person in the bureaucracy, but we actually have a really good long-term relationship. And I've often thought about some of the relationship metaphors that could be used in these partnerships, where there may be tension, but there's an underlying respect, there's an underlying understanding that in the case that you're talking about, if a government agency is getting defensive, over time they see, well, I can actually get more done if these other people are part of the process, and it can bring about a more diverse set of activities. It doesn't always start off that way. Also, you can have a situation where the government is knocking on the private sector's door, and the private sector is being very myopic and saying, look, everything's fine, don't bother me, and that's not in the long-term interest of the private sector as well. So I think it's one of those things. What happened in New York was it started off on a small scale. I'm the co-chair now of the New York City Bid Association. There used to be 3 or 4, now there's 70. And there's ones that don't exist just for the big commercial districts, but for tiny retail strips where their budget is only a couple $100,000. So I think it takes a long time. I think you could do a pilot where you say, let's try some different forms of partnerships. And and if you have the right people that are building a relationship, then people will start to see results. And the government folks that you're talking about who might be resistant are saying, I'm actually getting more done. The private sector folks may say similarly, they're getting some things done that they couldn't have gotten done otherwise.
All right, thank you for that question. Is there another question related to funding? Okay, lady at the back. I think it's Miss Boy, right? Yes. Hello.
Yes. Maria Boy from Institute of Park and Recreation. I'm the president. I was in Times Square just to experience the changes in September last year. And I went to Chinatown, and I was also looking at cycling in the city.
Could you speak up just a little bit? It's a little hard.
I'm looking at the cycling in your city, the Times Square, but of course there are lots more tourists than the cyclists. And may I know if there's statistics found in this Times Square area where people cycle to work, or are there things that has to change to make it more cycling friendly in this city?
It's a good question. We don't have good statistics on that. I think that the city's transportation department is getting better at tracking cycling, and it's become a much more cycling-friendly environment. In Times Square, there is actually going to be not fully throughout all of Times Square, but there's going to be a protected bike lane that goes down most of 7th Avenue, and so that'll be a big step forward in terms of bike safety. Right now, it's a little scary to ride through the middle of Times Square on a bike. And the other issue, which is something I think you all are dealing with as well, is where do the bikes park if they go into these office towers, because you've got to have that on the other end too.
Right. If you don't mind, I'd just like to now ask a question of Tim, and then I'll go back to you. But just taking up the point from the lady from the Times of India, is this issue of working with government authorities. I've had the experience of closing streets down to run a night festival at the Bras Basah area. First year we did it, I think the police said, all right, you shut the streets down, but you have to pay for the cost of it. We had a bill of $100,000, if I recall correctly, because we had to hire Cisco guards, etc. That ate into the programming budget. But we had about 250,000 people over one weekend. The next year we did it, and we said we closed the streets down, we paid the money, and we had 400,000 people just through that short closure of street in front of the National Museum to activate and connect the park to the museum, creating this huge forecourt, and we lit the museum out at trapeze acts, etc. Then the next year, the LTA said, no, traffic problems, you can't close the street. So we couldn't close the street anymore after that. So just asking you, I mean, you succeeded in closing 2 major streets in the heart of downtown New York. How did you do it? I mean, you've described how citizens rose up in support, you experimented, but here was a case where we did experiment. 2 years, great success, but the authorities said no. So how do you overcome such situations?
Well, I think, first of all, I have to give absolute credit to Mayor Bloomberg and his Transportation Commissioner, Janet Zara-Khan, because it was a real leap of political leadership and faith to take that risk and to say, here is a completely different paradigm for how we're going to look at this portion of the public realm. And there was intense criticism, and the elite in New York travel by car, not by subway, so it didn't, and they don't walk around Times Square. So some of the people that drove the conversation were experiencing Times Square only in one way. There were very, very detailed traffic studies that showed that the effect on traffic was nominal in terms of traffic getting worse. But I think it was only because people knew that Times Square was kind of a total mess before that they even tolerated the idea. Interestingly, in terms of how these things travel, we have a baseline question that we ask, which is, are you satisfied with your experience in Times Square? And we ask the public, we ask people that work in Times Square every day. And for the people who work in Times Square every day, that number was about 47%. After the closure of of Broadway, that number went up to 73%. Now we're back down in the 50s because of all these new conditions. So you can't be driven totally by the polls, but you have to know what's going on with that. But I think, in the case of something like that, my instinct is that I revert to how do I reframe the question. And that's why I think it's important to say it's all about the money, but it's also about the ideas. It's also about how do you reframe the picture? Are we recasting the notion of the public realm? Is it only for the cars, or is it that this is a kind of town square and this is a place where people can celebrate? Is it can we do surveys that show that people's perceptions are somehow improved because they've had this wonderful experience? And of course that's qualitative, not quantitative, but those things can count when you're, especially, I think one of the parallels that I've seen with Singapore and Times Square is, I think my perception is, from things I've read, is that you have some of the same brand issues that Times Square does, where people say, that I think you've done a lot to overcome recently, like, Singapore isn't as colorful as other places, it's Disneyland, and people will say Times Square is Disneyland, and how do you chip away at these things that hurt your brand, that are going to hurt your tourism economy? You have to incrementally show that you're shifting people's perceptions, and you have to say, this is a problem that we are solving. And there's some way in which, if you went from 250,000 people to 400,000 people in a year, you were addressing some deeper need or problem. But when we had our first conversations with the Transportation Ministry folks about this, before the new commissioner came in, it was only about cars. That was the only metric or only criteria for success. So the challenge so often is the framing. And that's also why I think where the NGOs and the civic organizations can sometimes help government, because sometimes the agency wants to do something differently, but the issue has been framed as only a traffic issue. And so we were really key when Jeanette Sadakan, the DOT commissioner, wanted to be innovative. She needed, I think it's fair to say, and she said, she needed us to help reframe the issue and to be an ally.
So just on that issue, I think it's an interesting idea of you working from the pedestrian point of view, because I share Stephen's point. Where he's coming from is the Orchard Road junction at Patterson Road between Wheelock Place and Ion, what is now Ion, was one of the busiest pedestrian junctions in Singapore. It's now barricaded. Pedestrians are not allowed to cross, they cross underground. So all that street life, as Stephen's point out, has gone underground. So how does one balance that? The people want to be on the street, but you offer them in Singapore cool air-conditioned comfort, it becomes Singapore underground straight away.
It's, the opposite end of this is something like, Toronto, where it's freezing, and so that's part of the reason some of those interior spaces have been successful. And I don't think there's easy answers. I think you come back to what is distinctive about the public realm, what can you do in a public space that you can't do elsewhere. And I don't know enough about the specifics of that situation to know what all the variables are that led to that outcome and to make a judgment about it. But I think that it's always coming back to what's the larger vision? That's why we say, what's your dream? What would you like to see in Times Square? Because right now people can only imagine the problems. But if we say, what if this were really a town square where all of the creative talent of New York City, through partnerships with cultural organizations, is on display in this place? You can't do that in an underground passageway. And you may not be able to do it on the sidewalks in Orchard. But what is the distinctive asset, and how, by partnering with other creative or distinctive assets that are part of your community or part of your place, can you get something where the whole is greater than the sum of the individual parts?
Excellent. Sorry, just back to this gentleman now for a question.
You largely preempted my question. I'm Bruno Wildermuth, by the way. I'm a former transport planner. But as we all know, Singapore is no longer a city for people. It's now a city for cars. The Orchard Road, Patterson Road is a good example of what the current policy is in Singapore. The benefits to cars in removing those pedestrian flows are absolutely zero. It's very straightforward, very easy to see. They can now move immediately when the light turns around the corner to wait the same amount of time up on Orchard Boulevard that they waited before on Orchard Road. So zero benefits at great cost, not only in terms of infrastructure, building underpasses, but in terms of doing away with pedestrian crossings at grade and several other underground crossings on Orchard Road. So again, my question is, what can we do to convince the transport people that cars is not everything, that a city is first and foremost for people?
I think that, first I think you have to be, my inclination is that one can't be ideological about it all. One has to acknowledge why it is that people have some of these concerns. So, for instance, for us, we have the Broadway theaters. A huge chunk of their repeat core audience are people in the suburbs who, because our public transport system isn't particularly good late at night, the day that they're going to go to see the theater after work, if they work in New York, they drive in. So there's a whole set of problems we need to solve in terms of public transportation. But so it was very important to the theater folks, as well as we have 20% of the hotel rooms in Manhattan are in our district, and so there's a lot of taxi drop-off and drop-on. So we had to pay attention to the legitimate concerns of the car people, because if we just said the hell with the cars, then we would have been cutting off our nose to spite the face, or our face. I say this as someone who believes that in America in general and in New York City, that the amount of public realm and financial energy and everything else devoted to cars is way out of whack. But we had to start off by saying, what are they trying to solve when they're making these changes that are not beneficial to pedestrians? And again, then we have to gather the data about how unhappy the pedestrians are. A theme of this current mayor is Vision Zero, which is wanting to reduce traffic deaths. So part of our plan for 42nd Street, which is incredibly crowded, is I tell my staff, take pictures of people walking in the street, because there is a public safety issue that must be dealt with. So documenting that. And then being incremental about it. This is something that Jan Gell has talked about a lot. And that notion of experimenting. Try closing down the street, as you've done, once a month, and you show that the world doesn't end, or maybe it does, and so that's not the place to do it. So I think that idea of taking a chance, doing things incrementally, and there is certainly worldwide, and certainly among urban folks, a real interest in recapturing part of the public realm, or more of the public realm, for alternative modes of transport. But it is the long game.
Is there a transport planner out there who has the opposite view, who might want to contribute? No transport planners? Thank you, Bruno, for the question. I used to work with Bruno when I still had hair, so it's good seeing you. Is there another question? Please.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jia Wen, and I'm from JTC, which is another government stat board. So I just want to say first, thank you very much, Tim. I think you've done a fantastic job with Times Square, because I remember the first time I went there sometime in 2008, and I stepped out of the subway, and I was just overwhelmed immediately by all the lights and the people and the billboards. And this is someone who has lived in the city like all his life. So really, I think great job. So my big question first is, I think there's a theme these days about public spaces, about whether or not we are spending money in Singapore, for Singaporeans, or spending like, the big projects like Marina Bay and Gardens by the Bay, are they for tourists, So Times Square is definitely a big tourist destination for New York, right? So would you say that Times Square is primarily designed for New Yorkers, for the benefit of New Yorkers, or for the benefit of tourists? And if your answer is both, then how do you strike the balance? And I also have a second question, which is that I think the main part of your job actually is getting all these different stakeholders with different agendas to collaborate with one another, right? So how do you get them on the same boat? Is it just money, or is it pushing through legislation? Or really, is it really about casting a powerful vision that unites everyone? So maybe some of your insights on these two questions would be great. Thank you.
So the tourist versus locals issue is at the centerpiece of my job every single day. And we are a very important part of New York City's economy, especially as the finance sector has shrunk. And I think that, again, I've been so impressed with Singapore being very strategic about how it has worked to make itself more known and more central to the growing, what is going to be the continuing to grow, enormous growth in tourism economy. And so I think it's a smart move competitively. But I think there's always a tension between the tourists and locals, especially if you get more successful with tourists, then the locals start to resent it and resist it. At the same time, tourists want authentic assets. They want something that's distinctive. And so much of our public art programs, so much of our other things are really, and that little series we did of your Times Square NYC, your Times Square, that's directed towards New Yorkers, because we have several 100,000 people that work in our district. At least half the people that go to Broadway shows regularly are locals. And so we are constantly thinking about, when we're making decisions about programming, is this something that feels like it's authentic New York? At the same time, I think when one thinks about a city as a whole, there's been a lot of conversation about having a diverse set of assets that you're offering up. So a tourist may come the first time and they want to see your major sites and major museums and iconic spots, but then they want to have not all of them, but some of them want to have a neighborhood experience. And so that idea of having, just as any corporation would do with its products, they've got distinctive offerings for different kinds of people with different interests, I think that's what you want to do. And I think the way you do that without losing your soul is this kind of assessment of your core assets and distinctive qualities. And that notion of it's not one size fits all. What is it about Chinatown that's different? What is it about the Arab district? What is it about the great area with all the Art Deco architecture? Yeah, Zhongbaru. And many others that I'm sure I don't know. Like, what do you really do to enhance and nurture those distinctive assets, some of which are physical, some of which are intangible? Your second question was about, how do you get the stakeholders, everybody did. So I'd say that, so every single day I'm thinking about tourists versus New Yorkers and struggling with that. And every single day, a huge part of my job is relationship building. And that was true in the parks. Now again, in the parks position, I was actually working I literally was an employee of both the Parks Department and an NGO. So my brain had to work in capture two things. And so I constantly have to be working on, I don't have any hard assets. I don't control, we have a management contract for those public spaces, but I don't actually, people say, what do you control in Times Square? It's almost nothing. And so almost everything we do is a result of relationship building and looking for this alignment of interest where the enlightened self-interest of the private sector matches that overlapping circle of governmental interest in making the city better, but not having the capacity to do too much for Times Square when there's needs all over the city, and that's being fair about it. And then other NGOs like ourselves that are civic organizations that are just trying to make the place better. And constantly on every single issue looking for those points of intersection, because that's when you hit the sweet spot. But it's all these basic processes of communication and patience and that circular ping pong table that'll make you crazy sometime.
Well, sitting here, I see a few white hairs on Tim's head compared to some of the earlier videos. So you can tell the toll it's taken.
Yes, I haven't shaved in 4 years.
Question.
Thanks very much, Tim. Raymond Kwok here. Can you share with us how you look at Times Square and compare to other iconic destinations? You mentioned about Singapore. We are trying to create quite a lot of different iconic stuff. For example, like Garden by the Bay. When you came here, when you see it at the beginning, it wasn't that fantastic. But as the plants start growing, and you can see the lighting, on the trees is growing. Basically, it's growing on you. So how do you look at Times Square compared to other iconic destination, and how do you use the measurement of whether do you have a sort of how much you invested in it, and do we know how many people visited and all those data as compared to other destinations?
We try and do it. It's often very difficult to do what we call apples to apples comparisons. So certainly we look at some of the basic things. We tend to do very, very well on most photographed place in the world or most Instagrammed. It's one of the reasons we pay a lot of attention to the social media and events like New Year's Eve or the solstice, which get images out there and then packaging what we do in a way that sort of lasts for people. I think always with this kind of competitive, you probably know Michael Porter and some of these ideas where companies go and talk about competitive analysis. And so you say, who are we competing against? And for different things, you're competing with different people. There's certain domestic destinations. There's a sense in which we compete with regionally with Philadelphia and Boston that are close by for people that are just driving around. Certainly a place like Chicago for international tourists. I look at how does Times Square compete with even lower Manhattan, the very southern tip of Manhattan, where there's a different business improvement district that has a lot of great assets. So I look at that. Obviously, the major city, London and Singapore and Tokyo and Paris, and things like the exchange rate and the strength of the dollar are major variables. I do a lot to try and convince the government in New York, which has been tourism has gotten so much better in New York City because you used to come here and you used to get mugged, or you used to come to New York and get mugged. And now the city is on display in a better and healthier way. So our tourism numbers have been off the charts, but we need to keep reinvesting in that. And just like, do we want to be BlackBerry or do we want to be Apple? Apple has a #1 product. They keep investing in promotion, and so and you have to be strategic about that. So I definitely noticed. I went to London, and in the backseat of a taxi cab, there's an ad for Memphis, Tennessee, and on the tube, there's an ad for Las Vegas. A great line. It says, for Las Vegas, it says, come to a place, this is in London, where your accent is an aphrodisiac. So I'm like, okay, they got a good ad campaign going on. So I look partially based on who's spending money. I say, obviously I think we compete with the major world-class cities, and then there's other smaller domestic destinations. And we don't have great metrics for measuring our success against those things, but the qualitative research about what people like and don't like about Times Square gives us a sense of what we need to work on.
Just like to take up that a point you mentioned about looking at other world cities in comparison, etc. I think, as many of you know, Melbourne, the city of Melbourne did not have a major public space, but they created a public space out of train tracks. It's Federation Square. I'm sure all of you know that. So learning from lessons like that, and in New York, I mean, you've created a public space out of roads. What do you think in Singapore would be that iconic public space?
Well, I think you've got something extraordinary in Marina Bay. I think it's very, very well done. There's so many, and there's so many places where cities got it wrong in terms of architecture or a cluster of activities in Marina Bay, and then the gardens and the other things in your, is it called the Botanic Gardens there, or is that the name of the Gardens by the Bay, where the big domes, which are extraordinary. So and I know that they're not inexpensive, so all these things are big investments, but I think you've done a very good job with that. But I also, when I first came here, I like staying in boutique hotels. I love architecture. The shop houses were just extraordinary, and I feel like even from the first time I came here, which is 4 years ago, I feel like they're being tended to more carefully, and I think that you can simultaneously say we are this modern, iconic, design-forward city, but also we are this place that has this really distinctive, because a lot of times when you go to that older architecture in other countries, it's run down. It's Havana, Cuba. It's not taken care of, and you have this, a really vibrant set of assets. So I think it's both the large. You've got an icon right there that's in all the pictures. It's on the magazines, and then you've got this much smaller scale thing, which is a set of really distinctive architectural assets and the multicultural aspect of your society and the extraordinary food. I think you've got these other things that are really that are making you very, very competitive. And the other thing was, I went to a conference in Sydney once, where they wanted me to talk about New Year's Eve, and it was at a conference about big events, because they said tourism is growing enormously in the Asian region, growing middle class, but Australia is just far enough away again that everybody sort of says, I want to go and see the koala bears and the kangaroos, but they need some reason to actually sort of get on a plane. And so so much of their tourism strategy, which I think is different from yours because you're so centrally located, has been about how do we create the kind of must-go-to event that gets people to cross that threshold and get on the plane. And so that's the kind of competitive analysis that we need to do in Times Square, and that I sense that you all are doing with respect to tourism, of what's your competitive set and what are your distinctive strengths and liabilities relative to not just places like Hong Kong and Shanghai and Tokyo, but these longer haul spots as well.
Is there any town planner or architect who wants to add on to this?
Thank you. My name is Ria. I'm from JTC. I'm an urban planner. I actually wanted to, first of all, congratulate you for a lovely presentation, and I'm sure we all have mutual feelings to that. And in regard of how you have done and transformed Times Square, it's highly appreciable. But if you don't mind, if you could shed some light about some of the major failures that you've faced in trying to make that transformation, and probably if any of us could learn some lessons from that. Thank you.
Well, I think we're totally failing on the management. I think that we spend so much getting the street closed, getting this. It's a city project, but we're every step of the way working with the city on building out the plazas. So it's this European-style piazza, and we kind of kept doing what we were doing in terms of public space management, and we've been completely overwhelmed by these things. Part of me feels like if we'd been more preemptive, if we had occupied the space more aggressively with programming and tables and chairs and food offerings, that would have been more, some of that activity would have been marginalized a little bit. It's New York. We should have all kinds of creative things happening on the streets, so I'm not saying it shouldn't happen, but it's the scale and scope of it. So I think we sort of got caught, we got overwhelmed by that, and the plazas haven't been open yet because they've been under construction. So once they are fully open, I'm bracing for the wave. I think my efforts to tell the story, the history of Times Square have failed so far. We set up that tourism center, and I tried to transform it into, because more and more people were going online for tourism, we said, why don't we try and reposition the center, which itself was a listed historic interior space, because it was the world's first all newsreel theater, where they used to show the 4-minute movies of, it was the internet of its time. We tried to make it into a little bit of a historic museum. I showed a slide of it, and it didn't really stick. And I couldn't convince my board to make a substantial, we invested a lot in fixing it up, about $1 million. I think to get it to the point where it would have been a successful destination in and of itself, we would have had to spend several millions, and I couldn't convince them that that was a worthy investment because they were watching our attendance numbers go down for tourism services. And so we gave up that space because the real estate folks wanted to rent it out. And so it's under renovation now. It'll be preserved, but it'll be some commercial space. And so I've been struggling with how do we, in an extremely high rent area, how do I have a physical space where I can tell the history of Times Square? And I think it may be that we've got some ideas we're kicking around about really crowdsourcing an online, a really rigorous, interesting digital online historical site. Because any place, any place that has emotional resonance, people have stories. So the idea of having people come and tell their story the first time they saw a Broadway show, the first time they came to this intensely urban place, and what it meant to them. Because Times Square is also a place of mythology about capitalism, about desire, about entertainment, and we can mine those themes, but it's really hard to do because there's certain narratives that are set, and then also we don't have a giant museum, and the place itself is to be experienced. So to get people to go into a museum, I can change the experience out on the street, but how do I remind them of the richness of its history and symbolism? So I don't think I've figured that out yet. And I also think there are some times where we haven't, the jury is still out on whether we're succeeding in really getting the city to have a longer term strategy with respect to tourism. We're doing fine, but the dollar is very, very strong. In the next 3 years, there's going to be a 20% increase in number of hotel rooms in New York City, which will lower the prices. That'll be good, but there's some real headwinds, and we need to be strategic. And folks like you are on top of your game. I mean, you're not directly competing with us because it's so far away, but we gotta pay attention.
Right, Tim. I'd like to close with. I'll ask a question, and maybe I'll let you, because I've been reminded about the time. A lot of what you have spoken has to deal with software. I think the soft aspects of Times Square is certainly what has sold the area. Of course, it's added together with the good hardware that you have. In fact, just to point out to the gentleman from JTC, a lot of it is actually well organized. You wouldn't realize it, but although the signages appear to be like a cacophony, there are very clear guidelines for the signages, lines to take, size, heights, etc. So it doesn't happen by chance. So a question I'd like to pose to you, Tim, is how much of this is orchestrated or organized, and how much of it is spontaneous? And how do you underscore that success of software, and what can we learn from it in Singapore? I mean, we've got a lot of hardware, but it's its soft aspects that truly are the heart and soul of Times Square.
I think it's a great question, and I think it's the essence of how you create a great and thriving city. People like Ed Glazer and others have talked about how it's this combination of density and diversity and that entrepreneurial spirit and difference that all comes together, and then again what I call this alchemy, something new is created. And I think for those of us that care about cities, whether we're in government or NGOs, this question is, how do you create a structure? And that's a little bit what I was trying to do with like the plants and the buildings. It's like, how do you create this structure that allows for the organic? That where it's choreographed, but it's chaotic. And I think that those series of questions I don't think there's an easy answer. That's why the metaphor of us as a theater set kind of works, is we're creating the hardware, and we're going to program a portion of it. But if this is a vibrant, lively city, there has to be space for the spontaneity, the unexpected, the surprise. And just as in the realm of economic development, you can't make people be entrepreneurial, but you want to create the conditions. And I think Singapore has been extraordinarily strategic about creating the conditions where people want to come here and do business relative to other countries and cities in the region. So how do you drill that down on the neighborhood level? And the basics of you can prime the pump, you can create a good space, you can set things in a different direction, but I think you have to ask the questions that encourage people to talk about their visions. You can give them a vision, but you have to really engage them, because that's why the artists are so valuable in my mind. The creative community can look at something that we see in the same way and see it in a different way. Great art helps you see things in a different way. And so how do we, rather than say this is what all the artwork is going to be, how do we think of ourselves as curators tapping into the entrepreneurial and creative talent, that soft talent that is going to keep the surprises coming?
Curators of public space, so to speak.
And curators of our cities.
So maybe we just take you as the last question.
Hi, thank you, Tim. My name's Lip Sin. I deal with heritage and places mainly. Today, one of the phrases I hear today that strikes me most is during the video we were told that Times Square is a place where people go there to watch people watching people, and that's and the organic landscape of the Times Square, the people, is something that is unique to it. If I were to visit the Statue of Liberty or Niagara Falls or the White House, I engage and I have a relationship with the physical structure rather than the people. And in Times Square and with the Times Square Alliances and the work that you do, what are the guiding principles that you have in building relationship with the people who work and live around there, as well as those who are transient and just visitors that are there for just a few hours? I ask this because I often wish, and I hope that it's also shared with some of our compatriots here in the audience, that when people come to Singapore, we want to make the people and the diversity of people in Singapore part of the landscape in their sightseeing trip, and that the people are part of the sites. And in New York, do you do that? What does your team do? What are the principles guide you in building that relationship with the people around there?
Sorry, what are the principles that guide
your team in building the relationship with the people around Times Square? Not just the businesses, but the people who are active there. Yes, because I don't think you put up signs or have a campaign. Well, how do you engage them usually?
It has to. It's very retail. I mean, literally, we do things like focus groups, where we had people who work in the office buildings. We have people who are regular theater goers. We divide up the segments of the market, and we have focus groups. And then, as one would do with any market research, the focus groups can lay the framework or help you formulate the questions that you ask in a broader way. Every few years we do a broader, more formal survey where we ask the baseline questions. How satisfied are you with your experience? But then we sort of say, what are the things more specifically that you like and don't like? There's no substitute for the basic William White thing or Jane Jacobs thing of just going out and watching what people are doing and knowing in a way that's much harder to do if you send an expert out. Just like, okay, that person, I can tell that person's a New Yorker, I can tell that person's a tourist, and noticing how they are acting differently in the space. And then you back it up also with some of the other sources. But we have a board of 55 people that represent institutions ranging from Viacom and Morgan Stanley and Disney to a small Italian restaurant that's been owned by the same family for 100 years. So that is a mini parliament for us that tells us what's going on.
Well, I think this draws us to the close of the session, but I'll just summarize some of the thoughts that we've discussed. We've talked a bit about private and public partnerships. We've talked about funding models. We've talked about a few ideas that we could have in terms of the spaces in Singapore. We talked about the importance of software and authenticity, as well as organized versus the spontaneous. And we also have Tim's ideas about Singapore. Thank you very much for sharing. And I leave it now to really thank Tim for his talk and for sharing his ideas. He's got so many years of passion and I think life in him. It's just so exciting to hear from him. And I'd like to promote the idea to anyone here of what Tim has talked about, the idea of having urban curators for a city. Urban curators to look at the software or localized areas of key areas in city and program it. Right.
And I just want to say thank you for all the things I have learned and keep learning from what's and I'm sure there's things that drive you all crazy that you want to change, but I feel I've learned so much. And I also just consistently, in the United States, we love to hate our government. And one of the things that is just so striking is the investment that Lee Kuan Yew made in having the highest quality people go into and be paid adequately in the service of the larger good. And I have so much respect for that, and constantly am meeting impressed by the depth of thinking and quality of the public servants in Singapore.
All right, let's put our hands together for Tim, please.
Thank you, Mr. Tompkins and Mr. Koh, for this very engaging session. In line with the topic of placemaking and Times Square's successful transformation, CLC takes this opportunity to launch our latest issue of our biannual magazine, Urban Solutions. In this 6th edition, we focus on the topic of active mobility, and we take a look at how cities can be better planned for its people and how active mobility contributes to better cities. We would like to invite Mr. Koo, Executive Director at CLC, to present our speaker and moderator with this book as a token of appreciation. Mr. Koo, please. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our lecture. We thank you for your participation, and we trust you will enjoy reading the Urban Solutions. If you have missed it, please approach our staff at the publication booth outside the auditorium for your copy. Do join us in our upcoming lectures in the upcoming months. We will also like to seek your feedback via email, so do spend a minute of your time to help us improve our lecture series. Have a good evening. So see you soon.